Imagine this. You're a black family, excited for a vacation, when an airline employee humiliates you, kicking you off the flight simply because of the color of your skin. What would you do? Would you fight back or let it go? Now, fast forward 5 years, this same family doesn't just get justice. They take over the airline's diversity board, completely transforming the company from within. Stay tuned to find out how one act of discrimination sparked a movement that changed the course of history. It was supposed to be a regular flight, a chance for the Johnson family to relax, enjoy their vacation, and forget about the everyday stresses of life. They were a black family, excited to board a plane for a much-needed getaway. Little did they know, this would not be an ordinary flight. It would be the day their lives would change forever, and not in the way they expected. The family arrived at the airport early, the kids buzzing with excitement, talking about the beach and the adventures they'd have. They checked in, went through security, and everything was moving smoothly until they got to the gate. That's when things took an unexpected turn. They were called to the desk by an airline employee, a middle-aged man who seemed more interested in making small talk than anything else. At first, it seemed like just another routine interaction. But that's when things started to feel off. Without any real explanation, the gate agent told the Johnson family they couldn't board the plane. "There's an issue," he said. The family was confused. They hadn't done anything wrong. There had been no delays or complaints about their behavior. The kids were excited, and the parents were calm. No signs of trouble at all. But the airline worker didn't seem to care. The tone in his voice shifted, and his body language grew tense. His eyes kept darting around, avoiding theirs, as if something deeper was going on. He said the family was being removed from the flight due to disruptive behavior. But there was no disruptive behavior. No shouting. No arguments. Nothing that would warrant being kicked off a plane. The family's only disruption was their skin color. The situation escalated quickly. The airline worker started speaking to a supervisor, while the family stood there, shocked and humiliated. Other passengers looked on, some whispering, others staring. The kids, just old enough to understand, were confused. Why were they being treated this way? What did they do wrong? The parents tried to reason with the worker, asking for clarification, but their questions were met with cold indifference. They were told to leave the gate. A supervisor was called, and in moments, the family was escorted off the plane. The entire scene was embarrassing. The Johnson family, who had done nothing wrong, was now standing in the middle of a busy airport, in front of everyone, being escorted away like criminals. Passengers gossiped as they watched them walk away. The family's vacation dream had just turned into a nightmare. What had happened to them was a stark reminder of the racism still lurking in everyday spaces. This wasn't just about a bad experience. This was about something far deeper, an injustice that no one should have to face. And just like that, their trip was over before it even started. But what they didn't know was that this moment, this act of cruelty, was only the beginning of something far bigger. The airline might have thought they could dismiss them, but the Johnsons weren't going to walk away quietly. They would fight. And 5 years later, they would have the last word. The Johnson family wasn't going to let what happened to them slip under the rug. What they experienced that day at the airport wasn't just a random mistake. It was a reflection of something much bigger, something that had been quietly brewing for years: racism. And they weren't going to sit back and let it go unnoticed. After being kicked off the flight, the family was devastated. They had come to the airport expecting a fun, carefree time, but instead they were left humiliated, rejected, and angry. The first night they could hardly sleep, replaying the events over and over in their minds, asking themselves, why did this happen? They knew it wasn't about what they did. It was about who they were. But the frustration was mixed with a powerful sense of determination. They weren't going to let the airline get away with treating them this way. The next morning, instead of simply brushing it off, the family made a decision. They would take their story public. They weren't going to let their voices be silenced. They took to social media and shared their experience, posting about the racism they had just faced in one of the most public spaces in the world, an airport. The video of their encounter went viral almost instantly. News outlets picked it up, people from across the country rallied behind them, and before they knew it, the Johnsons were thrust into the public eye. Support poured in from all corners. People were outraged. It wasn't just the black community speaking up either. Allies from all backgrounds voiced their anger, demanding justice for the Johnsons and calling for accountability from the airline. The hashtag number, Justice for the Johnsons, began trending, and what had started as a simple complaint turned into a full-fledged movement. But the airline's response was nothing like what the family expected. Instead of apologizing or taking responsibility, the company stayed silent. They issued a generic statement saying they were looking into the matter, but there was no real acknowledgement of what had happened. It was clear that they didn't care. They hoped it would blow over, but the Johnsons weren't giving up. They knew this fight was bigger than just them. It was about making sure no one else would have to go through what they did. They reached out to civil rights organizations, community leaders, and activists to keep the pressure on. Their story was now a symbol of how far the fight against racism still had to go, even in the most ordinary of places. As weeks went by, the anger only grew. What started as a personal grievance turned into a movement. People started calling for the airline to be held accountable, not just for the Johnsons' incident, but for any other cases of discrimination that had been swept under the rug. The family's decision to speak out had sparked a much larger conversation about racism in public spaces, and it wasn't just a conversation, it was a demand for change. But even though the public outcry was loud, the airline refused to back down. They continued to deny responsibility, and their lack of action only fueled the fire. For the Johnson family, the fight was far from over. They weren't going to let their voices be drowned out by corporate silence. The damage done to them couldn't just be forgotten. It needed to be addressed, and they were going to make sure of it. In the end, this wasn't just about getting an apology, it was about forcing change. The Johnsons knew they had to keep pushing, and they knew it would take time. But their resolve was strong, and their journey to justice had only just begun. As the weeks turned into months, the Johnson family's fight for justice only intensified. They weren't about to let the airline get away with pretending like nothing happened. They had shared their story with the world, and now they were holding the airline's feet to the fire. But the more they pushed, the more they realized that the system they were up against was designed to protect the powerful and silence the voices of those who dared to speak up. The airline's response remained the same: silence, followed by empty promises. They claimed they were investigating the incident, but the Johnsons knew better. They had seen this before. The cycle of denial, followed by a half-hearted apology, was nothing new. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of systemic racism that still existed in corporate America. Frustrated but not defeated, the Johnson family decided to take matters into their own hands. They started organizing with civil rights groups, using their platform to raise awareness about racial discrimination in the airline industry. Their story became a rallying cry, not just for their own fight, but for anyone who had ever experienced racism in a public space. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the millions of people who'd been pushed to the margins, ignored, and dismissed. But pushing the issue into the spotlight came with its own set of challenges. The family faced an onslaught of negativity from online trolls, racist comments, and even threats. People who didn't want to face the uncomfortable truth about racism began attacking them, calling them attention seekers, and accusing them of playing the race card. Yet for every hateful comment, there were dozens of others offering their support, encouraging them to keep fighting. The more the Johnsons fought back, the clearer it became. They weren't just standing up for themselves anymore. They were becoming a symbol of resistance. They became leaders in a movement that wasn't just focused on their individual case, but on changing the system that allowed this kind of behavior to persist in the first place. But despite their growing support, the Johnsons still faced tremendous obstacles. The airline continued to drag its feet, releasing vague statements, but doing little to address the systemic racism that had led to the incident in the first place. In private meetings, they'd been told that the issue was being handled internally, but there was no real change. The family felt like they were hitting a wall, and the pressure was beginning to mount. They were constantly being told that change would take time, that they needed to wait for the system to work. But they knew waiting wasn't an option, not when lives were at stake. This frustration became a driving force for them. They realized that the airline wasn't going to make any real changes until they were forced to. And that's when the Johnsons made their boldest move yet. They decided to take the fight directly to the airline's board members. Instead of waiting for the airline to offer them a seat at the table, the family decided to create their own seat. They launched a campaign to push for a seat on the airline's Diversity and Inclusion Board. They knew this wouldn't be easy. They knew they'd face resistance from people who didn't want to see real change. But they also knew that if they didn't take this step, no one else would. This wasn't just about a seat at the table. This was about taking control of the narrative and ensuring that the next time someone faced discrimination, there would be people in power who truly understood the stakes. As the Johnsons began their campaign to take a seat on the airline's Diversity and Inclusion Board, they quickly realized just how uphill their battle was going to be. They weren't just up against an airline. They were up against an entire system that was resistant to change. But they weren't about to back down. The more the family fought, the more they realized how much their story resonated with people from all walks of life. They were no longer just the family who got kicked off the plane. They had become the face of something much bigger. They were a symbol of resistance, a testament to the power of perseverance. With each passing day, their movement grew stronger. Social media posts turned into powerful petitions, petitions turned into public rallies, and public rallies turned into high-level meetings with activists, lawyers, and influencers who saw the family's story as part of a larger fight for racial justice. It was clear that the airline's refusal to acknowledge the problem wasn't going to hold up forever. Every time they issued a vague statement about improving diversity, it was met with more questions, more calls for real change. But the Johnsons didn't just want to expose the problem, they wanted to be part of the solution. The family knew that to bring about lasting change, they couldn't just be vocal critics. They had to be active participants in shaping that change. And the only way to do that was to force their way into the airline's decision-making process. They launched a full-scale campaign, sending letters, holding press conferences, and meeting with lawmakers to push for greater corporate accountability. They were strategic, smart, and relentless. The family knew that corporate America only responded to one thing: pressure, and they were prepared to apply it. But just when things seemed to be gaining momentum, they hit a major setback. The airline, under growing public pressure, responded with a statement: "We value all our customers, and we are dedicated to diversity and inclusion. We are already working with external experts to improve our policies." It was the same vague line they had used from the very beginning, and it made the Johnsons realize that the company wasn't taking them seriously. This wasn't about experts. It was about real, lived experiences. The airline wasn't listening to the people who had been directly harmed. The family, however, wasn't discouraged. Instead, they saw this as the exact proof they needed. This response, this avoidance of real accountability, wasn't just an insult to them. It was an insult to everyone who had ever been racially profiled or treated unfairly by corporate systems. It was proof that things weren't going to change unless the right people were in charge. That's when the family made their next move. They started pushing even harder for a seat on the diversity board. They knew that if they didn't take this step, the airline would continue to sidestep the issue, and nothing would change. They weren't asking for charity or a simple apology. They were demanding the opportunity to shape policies, to hold the airline accountable from within. Their fight was no longer just about their own personal experience. It was about dismantling a system that allowed discrimination to persist, unchecked, for decades. At this point, the media attention surrounding the family's campaign was impossible to ignore. Every major news outlet was covering the Johnsons' story, And the airline's continued silence was starting to backfire. People were talking about this issue, about the lack of diversity in the airline industry, about how real change was being blocked by powerful corporations, and the Johnsons were at the center of it all. The more the Johnsons pushed, the more allies they gained. Civil rights groups, activists, and even some employees within the airline began speaking out, supporting their push for change. Some even leaked internal documents showing that the airline had been aware of its diversity issues for years, but had done little to address them. By now, the pressure was mounting, and the Johnsons were more determined than ever. They knew that the airline couldn't continue to ignore them forever. The story had gone from a viral incident to a full-blown movement, and they were at the heart of it. After months of relentless campaigning, the Johnson family was finally starting to see the first signs of real change. The pressure they had been building, through protests, petitions, and media coverage, was beginning to take its toll on the airline. Behind the scenes, the company's top executives were scrambling. They could no longer pretend like everything was fine. The Johnsons' movement had grown too large, too vocal, to be ignored. Their call for a seat at the table had become the rallying cry for people demanding real action, not just empty promises. For the first time, the airline was forced to publicly acknowledge the problem. The CEO made an appearance on a popular news channel, where he was asked directly about the Johnson family's fight. The nervousness in his voice was clear. The once confident corporate giant was now on the defensive. "We take these matters very seriously," he said, but his words rang hollow. The public had seen enough. They weren't buying the company's generic responses anymore. Behind closed doors, the airline executives knew they were in trouble. The Johnsons had effectively turned the spotlight on them, and they could no longer hide behind vague statements about improving diversity. The growing backlash wasn't just from the public, it was from within the company as well. Several employees came forward, sharing their own stories of racial bias and discrimination they had witnessed or experienced within the airline. Some even leaked internal documents showing how little the company had done to address its lack of diversity despite repeated promises over the years. The pressure was mounting. Public opinion was shifting. The Johnsons weren't just fighting for their own justice anymore. They had become the face of a broader fight for racial equality in corporate America. The media couldn't stop talking about them. The hashtag #Justice for the Johnsons was trending again, and people from all over the world were showing their support. It was clear that the airline's reputation was on the line. But the real turning point came when the family received an unexpected call from the airline. It wasn't just an apology or a statement of regret. It was an offer to meet with the airline's diversity board to discuss their concerns. The company, now fully aware that it could no longer avoid addressing the issue, finally reached out. But it wasn't just a meeting. The airline was offering the Johnsons a seat on the board. It was a shock. After everything they had been through, after all the rejection and indifference, they were finally being given a platform to make real change. The airline wanted them on the board to help shape its diversity and inclusion policies. The Johnsons had pushed, fought, and made noise for months, and now they were being offered exactly what they had been demanding from the start: a voice in the decision-making process. But the offer wasn't a simple win. It came with strings attached. The family would have to agree to work within the system they had spent months criticizing. They'd be joining a board that had historically failed to address the problems they were fighting against. They had to decide whether to accept the offer and try to bring real change from the inside, or reject it and continue their fight from the outside. It was a critical decision. On one hand, joining the board would give them a direct path to influence the company's policies. But on the other hand, it meant accepting a role in an institution that had wronged them in the first place. The family had to weigh the costs and the benefits, but there was no hesitation in their response. They knew they couldn't stop now. They couldn't let the airline think they had won just by offering them a seat at the table. The real change they wanted wasn't just a seat, it was the power to shape the future of the airline, to ensure that no one else would face what they had faced. So, they said yes. When the Johnsons agreed to take a seat on the airline's diversity board, they knew it wouldn't be easy. They were stepping into a world that had for so long ignored the very issues they had fought to expose. But what the airline didn't realize was that the Johnsons weren't just coming to sit quietly at a table. They were coming to shake things up. They had made it clear from the start that they were only interested in one thing: real change. Now they were in a position to make that happen. The first few weeks were a whirlwind. Meetings with the board were formal, and the atmosphere was stiff. The other members, many of whom had worked within the company for years, seemed eager to appease the Johnson family. They offered polite nods and assurances that the airline was committed to improving. But the Johnsons weren't fooled. They knew these words meant nothing without action. And if there was one thing they had learned over the past 5 years, it was that empty promises wouldn't cut it anymore. At their very first meeting, the Johnsons made their position clear. They didn't want to sit around talking in circles. They wanted measurable, actionable steps. No more vague plans or committees. It was time to hold the airline accountable for its past failures, and for its future ones too. They demanded a full review of the company's hiring practices, a comprehensive analysis of the diversity programs, or lack thereof, and an honest look at how minority employees were treated at every level of the company. They knew the work wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to put in the effort. Their first major victory came within weeks. After a series of heated discussions, the airline agreed to release a comprehensive diversity report, a document that had been long overdue. The report was a shocking revelation. It showed that the airline had failed to make significant progress in diversifying its workforce or addressing complaints of racial discrimination within its ranks. The numbers were damning, and the board members could no longer pretend like they didn't see the problem. The Johnsons had forced the issue into the open, and now it was clear for everyone to see. The company had a lot of work to do. The Johnsons didn't stop there. They pushed for a complete overhaul of the airline's diversity training programs. They knew that simply bringing in a few more people of color wouldn't solve the underlying issues. The culture of the company needed to change, and that meant changing the way people thought and acted. The Johnsons pushed for mandatory anti-racism training for all employees, from the front desk to the flight deck. It was time for the airline to acknowledge that diversity wasn't just about checking boxes. It was about creating a culture of respect and inclusion. But the real challenge was facing the resistance from within the company. Not everyone at the board meetings was on board with the Johnsons' vision for change. Some of the older board members bristled at the demands for more transparency, for policies that would hold people accountable for their actions. They were used to doing things the way they had always been done. They didn't see the urgency of the Johnsons' mission, but the Johnsons weren't afraid of pushback. They knew that change, especially change at this scale, wasn't going to be handed to them easily. Still, they pushed forward, one step at a time. And with every small victory, they gained more allies within the company. Employees who had once been silent, but now saw the Johnsons as their champions. They listened to the voices of those who had been marginalized, ignored, and mistreated by the airline. They gave employees a platform to share their stories, to finally be heard. The more they fought, the more they realized that they weren't just making change for themselves. They were making change for everyone who had ever been silenced. One of the most important moments came when the Johnsons proposed a new initiative for the airline: the creation of a public-facing accountability board. This board would be responsible for monitoring the airline's progress on diversity and inclusion and making the results transparent to the public. It was an idea that had never been considered before, but the Johnsons pushed hard for it. They knew that if the airline wanted to regain its credibility, it had to be held accountable in the public eye. As the months went by, the Johnsons started to see the seeds of real transformation. The airline was forced to take a long, hard look at its past and its future, and for the first time in years, change seemed possible. The Johnsons had proven that they weren't just there to take up space. They were there to rewrite the rules. But even with these victories, the fight was far from over. The airline's leaders were still resistant to some of the bigger changes the Johnsons were pushing for. The road ahead would be filled with more battles, more setbacks, and more hard decisions. But one thing was certain: the Johnsons were no longer just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for every employee, every customer, and every person who had ever been made to feel less than because of their race. As the Johnsons continued their work on the diversity board, the deeper they dug into the airline's practices, the more resistance they encountered. The promises of reform and progress began to feel like they were running into a brick wall. There were moments when the family wondered if they could really change such a massive, entrenched system. The board members who had initially appeared open to change now seemed increasingly hesitant, even hostile. Their ideas for reform, things that had seemed like common sense just months earlier, were being met with pushback from those who feared the consequences of real change. The Johnsons had pushed for mandatory diversity training for all employees, a move that was met with some immediate resistance. "Why do we need more training?" some board members asked. "We already have diversity programs in place." But the Johnsons knew better. They had seen firsthand how ineffective the company's diversity programs had been. They weren't comprehensive enough to address the culture of discrimination that had been allowed to flourish for so long. The Johnsons weren't asking for more words. They were asking for real, measurable actions that would dismantle the old, toxic culture and replace it with one based on respect, equality, and inclusion. The family wasn't ready to back down. They pushed harder, gathering data from employees about their experiences with bias, harassment, and discrimination within the company. It wasn't just about hiring practices. It was about creating an environment where everyone, regardless of their race or background, felt valued and respected. This wasn't just about optics. This was about creating a culture where racial inequality wouldn't just be tolerated or ignored, it would be actively fought against. But change at this level doesn't happen overnight. The deeper the Johnsons pushed, the more obstacles appeared. Some of the long-time employees who had been in the company for decades resisted the idea that the culture needed to change at all. They argued that the company had been successful without these programs in place. "We've been doing fine for years," they said. "Why fix something that isn't broken?" The Johnsons knew exactly why: because it was broken. And it wasn't just about them. It was about making sure no other family would face the same humiliation and injustice they had. It wasn't enough to make things better for a few people. It had to be better for everyone, no matter their background. They pushed back, arguing that true success could only come when everyone had an equal shot, when everyone felt respected, and when bias was not just condemned, but actively eliminated. Despite the resistance, the Johnsons' determination began to pay off. More employees spoke out, sharing their stories about the discrimination they had faced within the company. Whispers that had once been ignored became loud voices calling for change. It became clear that the Johnsons weren't just pushing for the right thing. They were pushing for something that was long overdue. And little by little, the momentum began to shift. But the real breakthrough came when the Johnsons pushed for a comprehensive public accountability report, something that had never been done before in the company's history. This report would detail all the steps the airline had taken to address diversity, the outcomes of their diversity initiatives, and the company's future goals. For the first time, the airline would be forced to lay bare the gap between their promises and the reality of what they had actually achieved. It wasn't easy. The board members fought hard against the idea, citing concerns about public backlash, concerns that the airline's reputation would suffer if they admitted to past failures. But the Johnsons refused to be swayed. They argued that transparency was the only way forward, that without it, the company would never rebuild trust with its customers or its employees. Finally, after weeks of back and forth, the board reluctantly agreed. It wasn't a victory they had expected, but it was a massive one for the Johnsons and their supporters. The accountability report was released, and it was eye-opening. The numbers were stark. The airline had a long way to go when it came to improving diversity in hiring, retention, and promotion. But it also marked the first time the company had acknowledged the scale of the problem in such an open, transparent way. And while the report didn't provide all the answers, it gave the Johnsons a powerful tool to hold the airline accountable for its future actions. The airline now had no choice but to face the truth. The Johnsons had forced their hand, and in doing so, they had begun to reshape the airline's corporate culture from within. The battle was far from over, but it was clear that the Johnsons had succeeded in pushing the airline to confront its past and begin to build a more inclusive future. With the release of the airline's public accountability report, the Johnsons had struck a blow that would resonate far beyond the company's boardroom. The airline had been forced to admit its shortcomings, and the world was watching. The report revealed the deep flaws in the company's diversity and inclusion efforts, flaws that had been buried for years. For the first time, the airline's leadership was being held accountable, not just by their own employees, but by the entire public. But while the Johnsons celebrated this small victory, they knew the hard work was just beginning. The airline had made a promise to improve, but promises meant nothing without action. And though they had won this round, the fight was far from over. The Johnsons were now facing a different kind of challenge: external pressure from the public, the media, and even other companies that were watching to see how the airline would respond. The public's reaction to the accountability report was mixed. Many hailed the Johnsons as heroes, champions of justice who had successfully exposed the airline's systemic failures. Others, however, were skeptical. Some customers were outraged that it had taken so long for the company to address the issue, and they questioned whether the airline's efforts would lead to real change or whether it was just a PR move. Social media buzzed with debates over whether the company's commitments were genuine or just a way to avoid a lawsuit and public backlash. But perhaps the most significant pressure came from the airline's competitors. Other major airlines in the industry, which had quietly watched the Johnsons' campaign from the sidelines, were now starting to feel the heat. Many saw the airline's public accountability report as a wake-up call. They knew that the same scrutiny could easily be turned on them, and they weren't eager to have their own shortcomings exposed in the same way. Behind closed doors, airline executives at other companies began making phone calls to their counterparts, quietly discussing the potential fallout from the Johnsons' campaign. Some were trying to distance themselves from the growing scandal, while others saw it as an opportunity to take a stand for diversity and equality before the media turned its focus on them. But no matter what side of the debate they stood on, one thing was clear: the Johnsons' efforts had forced the entire industry to reconsider its approach to diversity. The Johnson family knew this was their moment to push for even more change, not just at the airline they were working with, but throughout the entire industry. They began reaching out to other companies, encouraging them to release their own diversity reports and to publicly commit to real, lasting change. They used their growing platform to advocate for industry-wide reforms, pushing for standards that would hold every airline accountable for its diversity practices. Their campaign, which had begun as a fight for one family's justice, was now becoming a full-blown movement aimed at changing an entire industry. Meanwhile, at the airline, the Johnsons continued to hold the leadership accountable for every misstep, every unfulfilled promise. The board began to realize that real change was not only necessary, it was inevitable. They knew that if they wanted to survive in an increasingly transparent world, they had to do more than just make symbolic gestures. It was no longer enough to create diversity programs or hire a few more Black employees. The entire system needed to be overhauled, from the top down. The family pushed for more than just diversity initiatives. They demanded structural changes that would make it easier for people of color to rise to leadership positions within the company. They worked tirelessly to ensure that anti-racism policies weren't just written into the company's mission statement, but woven into every layer of the company's operations. They pushed for hiring quotas that would reflect the true diversity of the population and ensure equal opportunities for all races and backgrounds. It was a long, difficult process. Many of the board members resisted these deeper, more radical changes. They argued that such moves would disrupt the company's operations, that diversity quotas would limit their ability to hire the best talent. But the Johnsons pushed back hard, citing the proven benefits of a diverse leadership team: increased creativity, better decision-making, and most importantly, an inclusive culture where everyone had a seat at the table. Then came the breakthrough. The board finally agreed to create an entirely new position: Chief Diversity Officer, a role that would sit at the top of the company and report directly to the CEO. This was a huge step. For the first time in the company's history, diversity would be a priority at the highest level of decision-making. The Johnsons had succeeded in forcing real systemic change, not just within the airline, but within the entire industry. And as the news broke that the airline was committing to a new era of transparency and inclusion, the Johnsons were there, leading the charge. As the months passed, the changes that the Johnson family had fought so hard for began to take hold, not just within the airline, but across the entire industry. The appointment of the Chief Diversity Officer, CDO, was a turning point, and it sent shockwaves through corporate America. The airline now had a direct line to the highest levels of leadership on diversity issues, and the ripple effect was immediate. Other major companies, afraid of falling behind or being exposed for their own failings, began to follow suit. The Johnsons, now recognized as pioneers in the corporate diversity movement, didn't stop there. They knew that true, lasting change couldn't just be about one company doing the right thing. It had to become an industry-wide standard. They used their newfound platform to push for even more transparency and accountability from other airlines, calling on them to release their own diversity reports and take action to ensure that they were creating workplaces where everyone, regardless of race, could succeed. The media continued to cover the Johnsons' efforts, and their story became a symbol of how perseverance could lead to real change. They were invited to speak at conferences, join panels, and collaborate with diversity organizations. Their story wasn't just a personal victory, it was a powerful lesson in the power of activism, persistence, and speaking truth to power. The Johnsons' fight had started as a personal quest for justice, but it had transformed into a broader movement that would inspire future generations to challenge the status quo and demand more from their employers and institutions. But while the public and media celebrated the progress, the journey was far from over. The challenges the Johnsons had fought against, racism, bias, and inequality, were deeply entrenched, and there were still many people within the airline and the broader corporate world who saw diversity as a buzzword or something to be done only to meet quotas. The family had succeeded in forcing the company to face its failures, but they knew that real change wasn't just about checking boxes or putting out a few diversity statements. It had to be about altering the very fabric of corporate culture. At the airline, while the appointment of the Chief Diversity Officer was a step forward, the Johnsons faced resistance from a few of the old guard, those who had been entrenched in the company for decades. Some questioned the necessity of the position, wondering if it was simply a way to appease the public. The Johnsons knew better. They had seen firsthand how easy it was for diversity programs to be sidelined or ignored, and they weren't going to let that happen now. So they took their fight to the next level. The Johnsons pushed for annual diversity audits, independent evaluations that would measure the company's progress and hold them accountable to the promises they had made. These audits would be published publicly, ensuring that the company's diversity efforts were always under scrutiny. It was a bold move, but it was exactly what was needed. If the airline truly wanted to show it was committed to change, it had to prove it year after year with concrete results. As the audits began to roll out, the Johnsons saw the first signs that their efforts were making a real impact. The airline's diversity numbers improved, but more importantly, the culture inside the company began to shift. Employees who had once felt silenced or marginalized were now speaking up, knowing they had a platform to share their experiences without fear of retribution. The new diversity training programs were starting to take root, and there was a noticeable change in how people were treating each other in the workplace. Still, the road ahead was long. There were setbacks. Some employees resisted the changes, some of the leadership didn't fully embrace the idea of having diversity measures tied directly to company performance, and some of the public still criticized the airline for not doing enough. But through it all, the Johnsons stayed the course. They kept pushing, advocating, and leading by example. Every victory, big or small, was a step toward the more inclusive and equitable world they envisioned. And then came another major milestone. The airline announced that they were creating an industry-wide coalition made up of representatives from multiple airlines to collaborate on best practices for diversity, equity, and inclusion. This was something the Johnsons had long been advocating for, an industry-wide approach to solving the systemic issues that plagued not just one company, but the entire sector. It was a huge leap forward, and the Johnsons were invited to sit at the table as one of the founding members of the coalition. The creation of this coalition was proof that the changes they had fought for were starting to become permanent fixtures in the airline industry. The Johnsons had gone from being just another family fighting for justice to being recognized as leaders in the movement for corporate diversity. And their work wasn't just changing their own company, it was shaping the future of the entire industry. The creation of the industry-wide diversity coalition was a game changer. What had once been a deeply entrenched and resistant corporate culture was now being forced to evolve. The coalition, which brought together major players from across the airline industry, had one goal: to transform the sector into a space where diversity, equity, and inclusion were the norm, not the exception. And at the heart of that movement were the Johnsons, whose personal fight for justice had ignited this entire shift. The coalition quickly set to work, creating shared standards and best practices that all participating airlines would follow. For the first time in history, the industry was collaborating on diversity efforts in a way that was transparent, actionable, and measurable. Airlines were required to release annual diversity reports, adopt standardized anti-racism training, and ensure that all employees, regardless of their background, had equal access to opportunities for advancement. The Johnsons had been a driving force behind this, pushing for these measures to become mandatory across the board. It was clear that things were changing, but change of this magnitude takes time. The Johnsons had known from the start that they weren't in this for a quick win. They were in it for the long haul, for a future where the experiences they had gone through, being humiliated and discriminated against, would never happen again. The process wasn't perfect, and there were setbacks along the way, but with each step, they saw real progress. Within their own company, the Johnsons continued to push for deeper changes. The chief diversity officer they had helped bring into power was now an integral part of the executive leadership team, ensuring that diversity was embedded in every decision the company made. They had pushed the airline to establish mentorship programs for employees of color, which were already starting to show results in helping them move into leadership roles. The airline had made a commitment to hire more people of color, but the Johnsons were making sure that those employees had a pathway to rise through the ranks, not just at entry-level positions, but at the highest levels of management. But the biggest shift was happening in the way people were thinking about diversity. It was no longer a program or a box to check. It was a core value that needed to be lived every day. The Johnsons had seen the power of representation and inclusion, and they knew it wasn't just about numbers. It was about creating a culture where everyone felt like they belonged, where their voices were heard, and their contributions valued. On a personal level, the Johnsons had gone through a transformation of their own. What had started as a fight for justice had turned into a lifelong commitment to changing the world around them. They were no longer just a family seeking revenge or an apology. They had become leaders in the movement for racial equity in corporate America. Their story had inspired countless others to take a stand, to fight back against discrimination, and to demand change. As the industry-wide coalition continued to implement its initiatives, the impact of the Johnsons' work started to become visible in the broader corporate world. Other industries, once hesitant to address issues of diversity, began to look at the airline industry as a model for reform. The idea of public accountability reports, annual audits, and industry-wide collaboration started to take hold in sectors like tech, finance, and healthcare. The movement the Johnsons had sparked was now spreading, and the world was starting to change in ways that no one had anticipated. But for the Johnson family, the fight was still personal. They knew that the true measure of success wouldn't come from policies or reports. It would come from the stories of everyday people. The workers who had been passed over for promotions because of their race. The young employees of color who had felt invisible in the boardroom. The customers who had once been treated unfairly. The Johnsons had made it their mission to ensure that their fight wasn't just about numbers. It was about making sure no one ever had to face the kind of injustice they had experienced. In the end, the family realized that their victory wasn't just about changing the airline industry, or even the corporate world. It was about changing the way society viewed diversity and inclusion. It was about proving that one family, one act of defiance, could spark a movement that would not only transform a company, but an entire industry, and inspire countless others to join the fight for equality. The Johnsons had transformed from a family caught in an unjust incident to global advocates for equality. Their story was now a case study in how perseverance, courage, and strategic action could challenge corporate norms and create real change. But with all the progress came a new set of challenges. As their influence grew, so did the expectations placed upon them. They weren't just being celebrated for their accomplishments. They were now expected to lead the charge for diversity and inclusion across all industries. Media outlets, government organizations, and corporate leaders from every sector sought their advice, hoping to replicate the success the Johnsons had achieved within the airline industry. It was a powerful position to be in, but it also brought with it an immense weight. The family had been through so much already. The years of fighting against a system that wanted to silence them had taken a personal toll. The constant scrutiny from the public, the media, and the corporate world had left little room for rest. At times, the Johnsons found themselves overwhelmed, asking themselves if they were sacrificing too much. Had they lost sight of their own personal well-being in the rush to change the world? There were days when the family questioned whether they could keep going at the pace they had set. As the industry-wide diversity coalition continued to grow, the pressure to keep pushing for broader change became more intense. They were constantly in meetings, traveling to different companies to share their expertise, and speaking at conferences to inspire others. The work was important, but it also began to feel like it was never-ending. They were no longer just advocating for one company. They were now helping to reshape corporate America, a responsibility that sometimes felt impossible to bear. And yet, every time they thought about slowing down, they remembered why they had started this journey in the first place. They remembered the humiliating experience of being kicked off that flight, the feeling of injustice, and the deep frustration they had felt when the airline refused to take responsibility. They thought of the countless others who had been overlooked, silenced, or dismissed because of their race. They knew they couldn't stop now. But there were moments when the weight of it all started to feel like too much. There were discussions at the dinner table where they asked themselves how much they could give without losing themselves in the process. Could they maintain their momentum without burning out? Could they continue to fight for change while also taking care of their own mental and emotional health? The family began to realize that the fight for justice was not just about changing the systems around them, it was also about ensuring their own resilience and well-being. They knew that they couldn't do it all alone, and they started to lean on a support network of friends, colleagues, and mentors who helped them stay grounded. They sought out other leaders in the diversity and inclusion space who could help carry the weight with them. The road ahead was still long, but the Johnsons had learned that they couldn't, and shouldn't, do it all by themselves. They also realized that the movement they had sparked needed to be sustained by more than just one family. It needed to be a collective effort. They began to pass the torch, training and mentoring the next generation of diversity leaders, people who could take the work to new heights and ensure that the changes they had fought for would continue long after they were gone. Despite the personal toll, The Johnsons knew they were making a difference. They saw it in the faces of young employees who now felt empowered to speak up. They saw it in the customers who no longer felt ignored or dismissed by the airline. And they saw it in the corporate leaders who were starting to take diversity seriously, not just as a moral obligation, but as a business imperative. The Johnson family had succeeded in changing an entire industry, but as they looked ahead, they knew the fight wasn't over. The work they had started was still in its early stages. The world was changing, but there was still much to be done to ensure that everyone, regardless of their race or background, had an equal shot at success. And as they continued their journey, the Johnsons learned an important lesson. Real change doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen just because one family stands up. It happens because a community of people, leaders, activists, allies, and everyday individuals come together to push for what's right. The Johnsons had started a movement, but it was now bigger than them. It was about the collective power of all those who believed in equality, and they knew that they had built something that would outlast them. The Johnson family had come a long way. What started as a personal fight for justice after being wronged by an airline had grown into a global movement, a movement that had changed the very fabric of corporate America. The airline industry was no longer the same. Diversity and inclusion were no longer just buzzwords. They were principles that every major company had to live by. But as the Johnsons looked back on everything they had achieved, they also realized that the fight was far from over. True, they had made remarkable strides, but the real test would be ensuring that the changes they had fought for would endure for generations to come. The industry-wide coalition they had helped create had become a powerful force for change. It wasn't just a one-off initiative or a trendy cause. It had evolved into a permanent fixture of the corporate landscape. The annual diversity audits, the public accountability reports, the new leadership roles dedicated to diversity, and the mentoring programs for marginalized employees were all signs that the wheels of change were turning in the right direction. The coalition had grown, and more companies were signing on, pledging to hold themselves accountable for diversity and equity in ways they never had before. But the Johnsons knew that all this progress could easily be undone if the momentum slowed, or if the next generation of leaders didn't understand the importance of sustaining these efforts. That's why, after everything they had accomplished, they decided to take one final step. They would create a legacy foundation dedicated to continuing the fight for racial justice in the corporate world. This foundation would provide resources, funding, and training to future leaders who would carry the torch forward. It was an emotional decision for the family. They had already given so much to this cause, and now they were investing their time, energy, and resources into ensuring that the work they had started wouldn't be lost. They wanted to ensure that young activists, business leaders, and future generations of corporate employees had the tools and support they needed to fight for a truly equitable society. The foundation would focus on providing scholarships, mentoring, and access to internships and leadership programs for underrepresented communities. They also wanted to make sure that companies, even those outside the airline industry, would continue to adopt the principles they had fought for. The Johnsons were tireless in promoting the idea that diversity wasn't just a moral obligation. It was a business imperative. Studies had shown time and time again that companies with diverse leadership teams were more innovative, more productive, and more successful. And as the years passed, the Johnsons made it their mission to make sure that every industry understood this truth. But even as they laid the groundwork for their legacy, the Johnsons knew that their work was far from complete. While much had been accomplished, systemic racism, inequality, and bias still existed in countless institutions around the world. They had made incredible strides, but there was still so much left to do. They weren't content to rest on their laurels. They understood that they would have to keep fighting, in different ways, for the rest of their lives. Because the moment they stopped pushing, the moment they stopped advocating, was the moment the progress they had worked so hard to achieve would begin to slip away. So, they continued to speak out, about the importance of diversity in all spaces, from education to healthcare to tech. They continued to share their story, not just to remind people of what had been accomplished, but to make sure no one ever forgot how much work still lay ahead. And as they passed the baton to the next generation of leaders, they did so with the confidence that their fight would live on, far beyond their own lifetimes. The Johnsons had learned that creating lasting change wasn't about doing it all yourself. It was about empowering others to join you, to take up the cause, and to keep moving the needle forward. As they looked back on their journey, they were proud of the work they had done, but they also knew that the true measure of their success wouldn't be in the policies they had helped change, but in the lives they had impacted. The young leaders who would rise up and continue the fight. The employees who now had a voice in the workplace, and the customers who felt seen and valued for the first time. They were the living proof of the Johnsons' legacy. And as they stood at the threshold of a new era, the Johnson family knew that their journey wasn't just about righting one wrong. It was about making sure that the world would never again allow injustice to go unchallenged. As the years passed, the Johnsons' fight for diversity and inclusion began to ripple out far beyond the airline industry. What had started as a campaign to change one company had grown into a global movement. Their story had inspired activists, business leaders, and everyday people around the world to stand up for racial equality, and they had become a beacon of hope for those fighting to dismantle systemic injustice in every corner of the globe. The impact was clear. In the U.S., major corporations in tech, finance, and entertainment began to overhaul their diversity policies, not just in response to pressure from activists, but because they saw firsthand the value of inclusive workplaces. Other industries began to adopt the Johnsons' transparency model, releasing their own diversity and inclusion reports, conducting annual audits, and taking serious steps to hold themselves accountable to the public. The principles the Johnsons had fought for were no longer seen as a trend or a political statement. They had become fundamental to the way modern businesses operated. But the influence wasn't limited to just the corporate world. The Johnsons' campaign for racial justice sparked conversations in universities, nonprofits, and government organizations. They traveled to different countries, speaking at international conferences, sharing their story, and encouraging organizations worldwide to adopt similar measures. The diversity coalition they had helped create had become a model for industries in Europe, Asia, and Africa, where companies were beginning to recognize that the fight for racial equity wasn't just an American issue, it was a global one. In one of their most moving moments, the Johnsons were invited to speak at a global summit on racial justice in South Africa. It was a humbling experience for the family, as they shared the stage with international leaders who had been at the forefront of anti-apartheid movements and other struggles for equality. The Johnsons spoke about the importance of transparency, accountability, and creating corporate cultures where diversity was truly valued, not just as a policy, but as a way of life. Their message was simple. Real change only happens when people speak out, when they demand action, and when they hold the powerful accountable for their actions. But it also came with a deep recognition that their fight for racial justice was part of a broader global struggle, a struggle that was being fought in every country, in every community, by people who had been historically marginalized. However, even as the global movement grew, the Johnsons had to confront the reality that change was not always linear. While there was progress in many areas, there were still plenty of places where resistance was fierce. The pushback against diversity initiatives was not just an American phenomenon, it was a global issue. In some countries, leaders and corporations resisted efforts to improve racial equity, claiming that diversity programs were unnecessary or too political. And in others, there were people who denied that racial inequality even existed. The Johnsons knew that this fight would not end simply because one industry had changed. Their work was now a part of a much larger, complex battle that spanned continents. Still, The Johnsons were determined to continue pushing forward. They used their global platform to highlight the successes and failures of companies around the world, showing what worked and what didn't. They celebrated the victories, like when international airlines adopted similar diversity standards to those in the US, or when tech giants implemented mentorship programs for underrepresented groups. But they also exposed the companies that continued to ignore the issue, calling them out for their lack of action and their failure to acknowledge systemic discrimination. And as their work continued to expand, the Johnson family realized something profound. They had started a movement that had become bigger than any one organization, any one company, or even any one family. The movement for racial equality and corporate diversity was now a global cause, one that involved millions of people working together toward a more just world. In a moment of reflection, the family realized that the change they had set in motion was like a wave, each individual action building upon the last, slowly but surely reshaping the world around them. The airline industry had been their first target, but now they were part of a movement that was changing industries, governments, and societies across the globe. The Johnsons had not only changed an industry, they had ignited a global awakening to the need for racial equity in every part of society. And even as the world around them evolved, they understood that they couldn't stop now. There was still so much work to do, so many more barriers to break down. But for the first time, they saw the seeds of real, lasting transformation being planted everywhere. Years had passed since that fateful day at the airport when the Johnson family was kicked off the plane. The pain and humiliation they had felt in those early moments had sparked a fire within them, one that not only changed their lives, but also ignited a global movement. From their fight for justice to their leadership in corporate diversity reform, they had come a long way, but they knew the battle wasn't over. It never truly would be. The family had achieved incredible things. They had reshaped an entire industry, created a global coalition for diversity and inclusion, and ensured that millions of people had the chance to be seen, heard, and valued. Their story was now part of the history of corporate America, a testament to the power of persistence, resilience, and courage. But despite all the victories, the Johnsons knew they had only laid the foundation for something much bigger. Looking back, they realized that the real change had always been about more than just policies or reports. It had been about empowering people, the people who had been silenced, the people who had been told they didn't belong, the people who had been discriminated against. It had been about showing them that they had the right to demand more from the world around them. And in doing so, the Johnsons had given voice to a movement that was larger than any one individual, any one company, or any one industry. But now, as the family reflected on their journey, they knew it was time to step back and allow the next generation of leaders to take the reins. Their work was far from over, but it was time for others to rise up, to carry the torch forward, and to continue the fight for justice. The foundation they had built, the lessons they had learned, and the networks they had created were now ready to support those who would take up the mantle. They took pride in knowing that they had inspired a new generation of activists, entrepreneurs, and corporate leaders who were committed to continuing the work of dismantling racial injustice. They had seen firsthand how powerful it could be when people stood up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against them. And now, they saw the same determination in the eyes of young leaders who were ready to take on the challenges of the future. The Johnsons had always known that change would take time, but they had also known that it was possible. The global impact of their work was proof of that. Still, they understood that the fight for racial justice wasn't just about systemic change. It was about a cultural shift, one that would take generations to fully achieve. And they were okay with that. They had made a difference, but the work would never be truly finished. It was a legacy that would continue to evolve, a legacy that was now in the hands of the millions of people who believed, as they did, that equality was not just a goal, but a right. Looking ahead, the Johnsons felt a sense of peace. Their journey had come full circle, from a traumatic experience that felt like the end, to a new beginning that had changed everything. They had never imagined that one moment could lead to a movement, or that one family's fight for justice could reshape an entire industry. But that was the power of standing up and speaking out. The fight had never been just about them, it had always been about something much larger, the idea that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter their race, background, or identity. As the family prepared to take a step back from the front lines, they felt hopeful for the future. They knew that the change they had fought for was no longer just a dream, it was a reality. And as they passed the torch to the next generation, they did so with the knowledge that the world was in good hands. A new wave of leaders was already stepping forward, ready to pick up where they had left off, ready to keep pushing the boundaries of what was possible. The Johnsons had started a movement, and now they could rest easy, knowing it was a movement that would live on, long after they were gone. One person's fight for justice can spark a global movement. When we stand up against injustice, no matter how big or small, we create the possibility for real change. It's not about waiting for the world to change. It's about taking action, challenging the status quo, and leading by example. Persistence, resilience, and the willingness to speak out can transform even the most difficult situations into opportunities for growth, equality, and lasting impact. The fight for justice is ongoing, and true change is built by empowering others, passing the torch, and making sure future generations continue the work we've started.